How many bad arguments for the existence of God can I address? Let's find out as I dive into every major theological argument, and some really silly ones, coming up in a series of videos. I've always wanted to make a video where I demolished all the major and some of the minor theological arguments in one place, so that when the religious tried to use them, I had a single place that I could send them and I didn't have to waste my time tearing these stupid claims apart over and over and over again. So I came across a list of arguments that seems to encompass most of the ones I commonly come across, so I'm going to do it. And because there are so many, this is going to take 4 videos. I will list which arguments I'm taking apart in the description of each video, therefore you can find them very easily. So let's get started looking at the first batch out of 40 commonly used arguments for the existence of God. First, we come to the cosmological argument. Now, this comes in a lot of different forms, but I will use this one because ultimately they are all the same. So here we go. Premise 1. Everything that exists, or that begins to exist, must have a cause. Premise 2. The universe must have a cause from 1. Premise 3. Nothing can be the cause of itself. Premise 4. The universe cannot be the cause of itself from 3. Premise 5. Something outside of the universe must have caused the universe from numbers 2 and 4. Number 6. God is the only thing that is outside the universe. Number 7. God created the universe from 5 and 6. Number 8, God exists. Now, of course, this all falls apart at premise 6, if not before, because it's just an unsupported assertion. It's a claim that cannot be validated in any rational way. And this is something that you will notice throughout most of these arguments. They only work for people who already believe that they work. For the rest of us, though, we look at these bald assertions and think, what the heck are you talking about? Because you could replace premise 6 with the flying spaghetti monster is the only thing that is outside of the universe, and that doesn't change the argument any. Some formulations, I think, recognize just how absurd this is and exclude that part, only asserting that there is something outside of the universe that is responsible, but that gets them nowhere close to their own personal God, except as an unspoken assumption in the back of their heads. So long as they cannot point to a specific cause for the universe, this argument really doesn't lead anywhere. At best, you can say that the universe must have had a cause. You can say nothing about what that cause might have been, or any of the characteristics that cause might have had. You certainly can't claim that the cause of the universe was intelligent, that it was purposeful, or that it even still exists. And of course, when you start to say that everything that exists had a cause, what caused the cause? It's why modern interpretations of this argument insert began to exist, as though that gets them around the problem. Because all they can do is just arbitrarily make up characteristics for their favored cause that says it's always existed. They can't prove it or anything else about their God. They can just pretend it has to be true because it gets them around the problem. But if they can just arbitrarily say that their God has always existed, why can't we just say the universe has always existed in some form? What's good for the goose is equally good for the gander. This argument is also hamstrung because it relies on the fallacious appeal to common sense. That's something that we will see throughout a lot of these apologetic arguments. The idea that because what we're used to in our day-to-day lives is our common experience, that's the only way it could ever be. The speed of light is 186,232 miles per second, and that's the only speed it could have possibly been because that's what we see. But if it had been 186,235 miles per second, we'd be equally convinced that figure is all it ever could have been because that's what we would have seen. Just because cause and effect work a certain way within our universe doesn't mean it has to be, or that that's the way that it works outside of our physical constants. So the assumptions made by this argument may or may not be valid in the first place. It all falls apart the second you really look at it critically. Number 2, the ontological argument. Here it goes. Premise 1. Nothing greater than God can be conceived. This is stipulated as part of the definition of God. Premise 2. It is greater to exist than not to exist. Premise 3. If we conceive of God as not existing, then we can conceive of something greater than God from 2. Premise 4. To conceive of God as not existing is not to conceive of God from 1 and 3. Premise 5. It is inconceivable that God not exist from 4. Therefore, God exists. Alright, this argument was first proposed by St. Anselm, and the problem here, obviously, is that premise 1 fails immediately. I can conceive of a God that is greater than every single God that mankind has ever come up with. Because the biblical God, for example, whether anyone likes it or not, acts like a petulant child in the Old Testament, something that I can certainly conceive a superior God to. In fact, the maximally great God that I can conceive of would never have created a world where evil could exist, or where pain and suffering could exist, thus making it greater, in my mind, to any other God that anyone has ever proposed. And certainly, I can conceive of God not existing. That's why I'm an atheist. Now you can say that means it's not God, but so what? I have no reason to take this God thing seriously. The very existence of atheists, in fact, the very existence of multiple religions disproves this argument immediately, because there are billions of people who disbelieve in the existence of every proposed God out there. Hence, premise 3 is blown entirely out of the water. Immanuel Kant refuted this argument by pointing out that it just uses existence as a characteristic, a property like being tall or having a tail. But that's not how existence works. I could follow the very same tactic and say that if you can conceive of Voldemort from the Harry Potter books, then Voldemort must be real because existence is one of his inherent characteristics. The fact that you can imagine something means it has to exist. Unicorns, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, every single silly alien invader in every single 50s sci-fi B-movie, all of those things have to be real because someone imagined them. I trust you can see how this whole line of thinking is just absurd. Number 3, the teleological argument. Here we go. Premise 1. Whenever there are things that cohere only because of a purpose or function, for example, all the complicated parts of a watch that allow it to keep time, we're going for the watchmaker example here, we know that they had a designer who designed them with that function in mind. They are too improbable to have arisen by random physical processes. A hurricane blowing through a hardware store could not assemble a watch, or a tornado couldn't go through a junkyard and create a plane. Number 2. Organs of living things, such as the eye and the heart, cohere only because they have a function. For example, the eye has a cornea, lens, retina, iris, eyelids, yada yada yada, which are found in the same organ only because together they make it possible for the animal to see. Number 3. These organs must have a designer who designed them with that function in mind, just as a watch implies a watchmaker, and eye implies an eye maker from 1 and 2. Number 4, these things have not had a human designer. Number 5, therefore, these things must have had a non-human designer from 3 and 4. Number 6, God is the non-human designer from 5. Number 7, God exists. Now, this is an interesting one because it has a variety of forms, 3 of which are more modern concepts that I will address briefly as independent arguments, but they all suffer from the same basic problems. The problem is that we know that nature can, and does, create very complex-looking forms with no designer involved. Snowflakes are a perfect example. Water droplets freeze around a particle of dust in the high atmosphere, and as they fall, atmospheric conditions that the crystal is exposed to change the shape of the snowflake. And because all sides of the snowflake are exposed to the same conditions, they're all more or less symmetrical. No designer required. Or the evolution of the eye, which creationists often use to justify their silly beliefs, which can be explained quite easily as a series of evolutionary changes over time where each element changes. Now I'll put a link to a video in the description where Richard Dawkins explains the sequence of events where each different mutation provides a useful version of the eye. Argument number 4. The argument from irreducible complexity. Premise 1. Evolution has no foresight, and every incremental step must be an improvement over the preceding one, allowing the organism to survive and reproduce better than its competitors. Premise 2. In many complex organs, the removal or modification of any part would destroy the functioning whole. Examples are the lens and retina of the eye, the molecular components of blood clotting, and the molecular motor powering the cell's flagellum. Call these organs irreducibly complex. Premise 3. These organs could not have been useful to the organisms that possess them in simpler forms from 2. Premise 4. The theory of natural selection cannot explain these irreducibly complex systems from 1 and 3. Premise 5. Natural selection is the only way out of the conclusions of the classical teleological argument. Premise 6. God exists from 4 and 5 and the classical teleological argument. Now, this argument came about at the time of Darwin, and he answered it quite well. Premise 2, as I showed previously, is simply wrong. An eye without a lens can still see. It can still detect light and shadow, just not as well as an eye with a lens can. It still serves a useful purpose. It is simply made better through evolution. No designer required. Further, we can show that premise 3 is wrong because even if the organ would have been useless for one purpose without all of the parts, that doesn't mean it wasn't useful for something else. Now, the classical example here is Michael Behe's claim that the bacterial flagellum could not have come about naturally. Behe claims that there are so many precise parts that it couldn't have had another function, except he's wrong. The flagellum is extremely similar to another bacterial structure called the injectosome, which is used to punch holes in the cell walls of the host. The genes that code for them are so remarkably similar that it's undeniable that they came from the same genetic ancestor. We are looking at something that is a modification of another formation with an entirely different function. Behe, as was proven in the Kitzmiller-Dover court case, is simply wrong. So too, we can also look at the wings of insects, where creationists claim they were useless before they were large enough to allow the insect to fly. But in fact, insects use them for heat exchangers to keep the insect cool, flapping them back and forth to allow air to pass over blood vessels and cool the blood. Then they got large enough to allow them to glide and eventually to fly, and the rest is history. And finally, even for those things that we can't come up with a useful function for, that doesn't mean it wasn't there. Science learns constantly. We don't pretend to know it all, but there has never been a single case where science has thrown up its hands and said, "We can't figure it out. It must have been supernatural." In fact, there has never been a single demonstrable supernatural explanation for anything ever in the history of the universe. What the religious are really doing here is exercising the fallacy known as the argument from ignorance. We don't know, therefore God. But it doesn't work that way. God is not an explanation that you can just throw at things you don't understand. You actually have to prove that God explains your argument, and to date, the religious have been absolutely terrible at providing any evidence whatsoever that their God is real. And without doing that, their claims are completely empty. Bad argument number 5. The argument from the paucity of benign mutations. Premise 1. Evolution is powered by random mutations and natural selection. Premise 2. Organisms are complex, improbable systems, and by the laws of probability, any change is astronomically more likely to be for the worse than for the better. Premise 3. The majority of mutations would be deadly for the organisms from 2. Premise 4. The amount of time it would take for all benign mutations needed for the assembly of an organ to appear by chance is preposterously long from 3. Premise 5. In order for evolution to work, something outside of evolution had to bias the process of mutation, increasing the number of benign ones from 4. Premise 6. Something outside of the mechanism for biological change, the prime mutator, that's a cool name, isn't it, must bias the process of mutations for evolution to work from 5. Premise 7. The only entity that is both powerful enough and purposeful enough to be the prime mutator is God. Premise 8. God exists. Well, this is just a mess. But one of the biggest problems is that premise 2 is faulty. If we're talking about a single organism, then sure, having a ton of mutations, especially large-scale mutations, would be bad for that particular organism much of the time. But there's two things that need to be understood. First, every organism on the planet has mutations. You do, I do, your dog or cat does, everything does. Cell replication is rarely perfect. You are carrying around thousands of mutations in your body right this minute, and you're doing just fine. The vast majority of mutations are totally neutral. They do nothing good for you, and they do nothing bad for you. They're just sitting there doing nothing. Secondly, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about populations. Millions and millions of individuals, each with their own mutations, some of which may be beneficial for survival, and some of which might be detrimental. The detrimental mutations tend to be removed from the gene pool because those individuals don't tend to breed as much or as successfully. The beneficial mutations tend to be amplified in the population because they reproduce more. And mutations don't have to be all good or bad. Take sickle cell anemia in humans. It's a bad mutation. It will eventually kill you. But it also provides protection against malaria, which will kill you even faster. So in areas where malaria is prevalent, people with sickle cell anemia have a distinct evolutionary advantage because those people will survive longer and they will reproduce more, passing on those faulty genes that make their offspring more likely to survive to adulthood and reproduce as well. It's only when you take those people outside of malaria-prone areas where their advantage becomes a disadvantage. Now they're protected against a disease that isn't prevalent, so they're just dying early, and it gives them no evolutionary advantage. Honestly, these kind of arguments only work for people who don't know what the hell they're talking about. Argument 6. The new argument from the original replicator. Premise 1. Evolution is the process by which an organism evolves from simpler ancestors. Premise 2. Evolution by itself cannot explain how the original ancestor, the first living thing, came into existence from 1. Premise 3. The theory of natural selection can deal with this problem only by saying the first living thing evolved out of non-living matter from 2. Premise 4. That non-living matter itself, call it the original replicator, must be capable of self-replication, generating a functioning mechanism out of surrounding matter to protect itself against falling apart, and surviving slight mutations to itself that will result in slightly different replicators. Premise 5. The original replicator is complex from 4. Premise 6. The original replicator is too complex to have arisen from purely physical processes from 5 in the classical teleological argument, which you've already done away with. For example, DNA, which currently carries the replicated design of organisms, cannot be the original replicator because DNA molecules requires a complex system of proteins to remain stable and to replicate, and could not have arisen from natural processes before complex life existed. That was a mouthful. Premise 7. Natural selection cannot explain the complexity of the original replicator from 3 and 6. Premise 8. The original replicator must have been created rather than have evolved from 7 and the already debunked classical teleological argument. Premise 9. Anything that was created requires a creator. Premise 10. God exists. All right, there's a ton wrong here, so let's go step by step. Premise 1 assumes, wrongly, that evolution has anything to do with complexity. It is a silent assertion that there's a goal to evolution, which is wrong. And this happens a lot because a lot of religious people want to put humans at the top of the natural hierarchy to think that we're special and everything else is somehow beneath us. And that's simply false. It's an emotional argument that does not bear up under rational scrutiny. Premise 2 is false. It's just completely false. We do have a lot of ideas how it happened, but that's not evolution, that's abiogenesis, an entirely different field. Evolution has nothing at all to do with the origin of life, only with what that life does once it exists. Just read up on the work of Dr. Sidney Fox from the 70s, or even Charles Carter and Richard Wolfenden, both doing excellent work at the University of North Carolina today. Therefore, because the argument doesn't even know what evolution is, it doesn't actually say anything worthwhile. And of course, The biggest problem that we always have here is between 9 and 10. It says there must have been a creator. It assumes without any evidence that that creator was God. Sorry, doesn't work that way. Bad argument 7. The argument from the Big Bang. This will be good. Premise 1. The Big Bang, according to the best scientific opinion of our day, was the beginning of the physical universe, including not only matter and energy, but space and time and the laws of physics. Premise 2. The universe came to be ex nihilo, from 1. Premise 3. Something outside of the universe, including outside of its physical laws, must have brought the universe into existence, from 2. Premise 4. Only God could exist outside the universe. Premise 5. God must have caused the universe to exist, from 3 and 4. Premise 6. God exists. Alright, this is really silly if you think about it. Premise 1 is fine, but Premise 2 actually describes their own side, not the side of science. Science doesn't say that the universe poofed into existence from nothing. That's the religious. This is just projection. And when you look at this, it has every single one of the flaws from the cosmological argument because it's essentially a restatement. It's just a giant argument from ignorance. We don't get it, therefore God. In fact, if you notice, that's how virtually all of these arguments play out. Something the religious don't understand, combined with something they already accept on blind faith, leads to God did it. And when you think about it, just by shifting premise 4, any God could be responsible, or anything at all. If we arbitrarily make premise 4 only Mickey Mouse could exist outside the universe, then the conclusion that Mickey Mouse exists works. It doesn't mean anything, but it logically follows. And this is something you will see throughout all of these arguments, that the religious are effectively trying to define their God into existence. They will tell you what their God is like, no proof, no evidence required or even possible. They just tell you how they arbitrarily defined their God, and they expect you to believe it, therefore their God is real. It just doesn't work that way, though. In a previous argument, I pointed out that arbitrarily redefining Voldemort as existing doesn't actually make Voldemort exist. To prove that, you'd have to have actual, objectively verifiable evidence for Voldemort existing in the real world. And without it, all the claims that you can possibly make don't mean a thing. And the same is true of God. Too bad the religious can't get that through their heads. Number 8. The arguments from the fine-tuning of physical constants. Premise 1. There are a vast number of physically possible universes. Premise 2. A universe that would be hospitable to the appearance of life must conform to some very strict conditions. Everything from the mass ratios of atomic particles to the number of dimensions of space to the cosmological parameters that rule the expansion of the universe must be just right for stable galaxies, solar systems, planets, and complex life to evolve. Premise 3. The percentage of possible universes that would support life is infinitesimally small, from 2. Premise 4. Our universe is one of those infinitesimally improbable universes. Premise 5. Our universe has been fine-tuned to support life, from 3 and 4. Premise 6. There is a fine-tuner, from 5. Premise 7. Only God could have the power and the purpose to be the fine-tuner, therefore God exists. Alright, this is way too common and falls apart completely when you point one thing out. It goes back to the religious having a real interest in thinking humanity is special, even though we're not. So, off to premise 2, where these things far too often explode. A universe that would be hospitable to the appearance of life. What life? Our life. Not any possible life, our life. Because the religious are so convinced that humanity had to be the goal of everything that they're only willing to consider us in their calculations. But the reality is that life, any life, is the result of the conditions under which it evolves. We are not the goal of evolution. We are the current end result, at least on this planet. We're here because of the conditions that existed on this planet. If the conditions had been different, whatever life had evolved, if any life had evolved at all, would have been different. It would have fit into the ecosystem that existed to support it. And so all of the arguments that are made, all of the calculations that the religious like to trot out on the physical constants of the universe, all of them are based on a very bad understanding of reality. The universe isn't here for us. We're here because the universe happens to have the right characteristics for our form of life to arise. And if the universe had been different, so too would anything that came about. Number 9. The argument from the beauty of physical laws. Premise 1. Scientists use aesthetic principles, simplicity, symmetry, elegance to discover the laws of nature. Premise 2. Scientists could only use aesthetic principles successfully if the laws of nature were intrinsically and objectively beautiful. Premise 3. The laws of nature are intrinsically and objectively beautiful from 1 and 2. Premise 4. Only a mind-like being with an appreciation of beauty could have designed the laws of nature. Premise 5. God is the only being with the powerful and purpose to design beautiful laws of nature. Premise 6. God exists. Alright, scientists don't use aesthetic principles to discover anything. They use observation. They might describe things in aesthetic terms sometimes, but that doesn't mean that reality is objectively beautiful because there's no such thing as objective beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is derived from cultural standards, and once again, we see the religious using humanity as the yardstick for measuring all other things. Besides, if God only creates beauty, then why is there any such thing as ugliness? Why is there even a concept for being ugly? Why are there ugly things in the world? This is the same reason that the problem of evil works. If God were all good, then how can even the concept of bad exist? The answer, of course, is that it couldn't. But the religious don't think about the ramifications of their beliefs. They only want to feel good by believing it. A God that wants to create beauty or goodness, a God that can only create beauty or goodness, should not be able to create anything else. Yet here we are. And finally, the last argument for this video, bad argument number 10, the argument from cosmic coincidences. Premise 1. The universe contains many uncanny coincidences, such as the diameter of the moon, as seen from the Earth, is the same as the diameter of the sun, as seen from the Earth, which is why we have a spectacular eclipse when the corona of the sun is revealed. Number 2. Coincidences are, by definition, overwhelmingly improbable. Number 3. The overwhelmingly improbable defies all statistical explanation. Number 4. These coincidences are such as to enhance our odd appreciation for the beauty of the natural world. Premise 5. These coincidences must have been designed in order to enhance our odd appreciation of the beauty of the natural world, from 3 and 4. Premise 6. Only a being with the power to affect such uncanny coincidences and the purpose of enhancing our odd appreciation of the beauty of the natural world could have arranged these uncanny cosmic coincidences. Number 7. Only God could have been the being with such power and such purpose. Therefore, God exists. Now, I addressed this in a Muslim video previously, that the distance between the Earth and the Moon and the Earth and the Sun varies over the course of the year, such that depending on the time of the year, the Moon really isn't the same size as the Sun during a total eclipse. But honestly, this is where you start seeing the religious desperately casting about, looking for anything that they can co-opt into an argument to rationalize their beliefs. But they get impressed by the most unimpressive things. Premise 2 says that these coincidences are overwhelmingly improbable. No, they're not. Everything, absolutely everything, is a coincidence. Absolutely everything. The person that you walked by on the street today, you being in exactly the right place to walk by exactly that person, is totally coincidental. You just didn't take note of it because it wasn't exceptional, and it happens hundreds or thousands of times a day. But think about it. Exactly how many things had to go exactly right, both in your life, the other person's life, in fact, in every single person's life that either you or the other person ever encountered during the day, to place both of you in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The chances are absurdly remote, yet there you were. They simply don't understand odds and statistics, which is why their arguments fall apart so readily. And again, this is just a giant argument from ignorance. I can't explain it, therefore God. Nowhere have they demonstrated that any of their assertions about God are actually true. This is an ongoing problem that isn't changing in any of the remaining claims, and that alone is enough to do away with absolutely all of them. I trust that you're recognizing a common theme of irrationality running throughout all of these supposed arguments. It's all fallacious, badly constructed, badly reasoned claims with no justification, evidence, or rationality behind it. And for some weird reason, these tend to convince the religious, or at the very least give them comfort that there are seeming arguments in favor of their emotionally comforting worldview, even though no one in their right mind gives these crazy claims any credit. And with 10 down and 30 more to come, do we honestly think we're going to find a single argument that doesn't fall into the same ridiculous trap, where it won't be blind faith and the argument from ignorance masquerading as a supposedly credible philosophical argument? Yeah, I don't either. Because the one thing the religious do not seem to understand is that you cannot prove anything about the real world, about anything that is objectively real, through philosophy. It simply can't be done. But they have nothing else, and they know, or at least on some level, that they have nothing else, which is why they're willing to stoop as low as they do in a desperate attempt to make it look, even if on a very shallow level, like their faith isn't completely misplaced. But let's be honest, it is. It can't be anything else. Bad arguments and a lot of hand-waving don't do away with the massive problems of religious belief. It just hides the worst of it from people who really aren't all that concerned if what they believe is true. So come back next time as I tackle another 10 terrible religious arguments. Will they be any better? I've got no idea, but I wouldn't be holding my breath. The argument from answered prayers. Premise 1. Sometimes people pray to God for good fortune, and against enormous odds, their calls are answered. For example, a parent prays for the life of their dying child, and the child recovers. Premise 2. The odds of the beneficial event happening are enormously slim, from 1. Premise 3. The odds that the prayer would have been followed by recovery out of sheer chance are extremely small, from 2. Premise 4. The prayer could only have been followed by the recovery if God listened to it and made it come true. Conclusion: God exists. Alright, unfortunately for the religious, nothing fails as miserably as prayer. In virtually every study, prayer succeeds only as well as random chance. A 2006 meta-study concluded that prayer had no discernible effect, and a 2007 systemic review of intercessory prayer concluded that religious studies failed to produce significant findings. And this has been going on for decades. The first study of which I'm aware dates back to 1872, where Francis Galton found no correlation between prayers made for the British royal family and their health, well-being, or happiness. Double-blind studies invariably find that prayer gets you nowhere. Now, getting back to this argument, it's funny how they're looking only at the hits and ignoring the massive number of misses, isn't it? I mean, how many people are praying for food, people who are starving worldwide, and then they die of malnutrition? It's so silly that Christians have a saying that if God doesn't provide, then his answer to your prayer is no. Well, how do you tell the difference between a God that overwhelmingly doesn't answer prayers at all and says no a lot, and one that simply doesn't exist? I've got no idea, but this is one of the more absurd arguments I've seen. The argument from A Wonderful Life. Premise 1. Sometimes people who are lost in life find their way. Premise 2. These people could not have known the right way on their own. Premise 3. These people were shown the right way by something or someone other than themselves, from 2. Premise 4. There is no person showing them the way. Premise 5. God alone is a being who is not a person and who cares about each of us enough to show us the way. Premise 6. Only God could have helped these lost souls, from 4 and 5. Therefore, God exists. Yeah, sorry, but no, this is just stupid. It is filled with empty claims and absurd beliefs. And this is something that you will see among the religious a lot, so it's no surprise that it pops up in their apologetics all the time. People are pathetic and worthless. It's one of the core principles of most religious traditions. Therefore, without some imaginary man in the sky, man can never achieve anything, and if they ever do achieve anything, God has to be responsible. Says who? Why can't it be super powerful aliens? Why not those pesky, invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies? And even if it is a god, who says it's their god? Why does it have to be theirs? How do they know? They seem to be unable to propose any test to show that it was God, as opposed to, say, Zeus or Ra or Baal. So why are we supposed to take these unsupported claims at all seriously? This argument effectively follows the people are dumb model by saying that they can't possibly solve their own problems. They have to have a helping hand from an imaginary friend because otherwise we're too pathetic to do anything on our own. And of course, we see the leap of irrationality from 6 to 7 that appears in every single one of these arguments, because only God could have done this, therefore God exists. Says who? Well, blind faith, because that's all they've got. It's why these arguments don't impress anyone that isn't already a true believer. The argument from miracles. Premise 1. Miracles are events that violate the laws of nature. Premise 2. Miracles can be explained only by a force that has the power of suspending the laws of nature for the purpose of making its presence known or changing the course of human history from 1. Premise 3. Only God has the power and the purpose to carry out miracles from 2. Premise 4. We have a multitude of written and oral reports of miracles. Indeed, every major religion is founded on a list of miracles. Premise 5. Human testimony would be useless if it were not, in the majority of cases, veridical. Premise 6. The best explanation for why there are so many reports testifying to the same thing is that the reports are true from 5. Premise 7. The best explanation for the multitude of reports of miracles is that miracles have indeed occurred from 6. Therefore, God exists from 3 and 7. Okay, now show any miracles that have actually happened. Not things that we don't understand, things that actually violate the laws of nature. Not our understanding of the laws of nature, but the laws themselves. And that's exactly where the religious go entirely off the rails, because they obviously can't do that. At best, humans can only report that they saw something they can't explain. Unfortunately, they immediately try to explain it and claim that God did it. And I'm sorry, but you can't get from A to B in any credible way. Saying that you don't know what happened, then explaining what happened. Because unless you have some means of showing that you can discover the truth, not what you believe, but demonstrable, objectively verifiable truth, the claim is empty and no one ought to be impressed. Why anyone is, I will never understand. This is really just another argument from ignorance. I don't know, therefore God. But that isn't an actual explanation. It's a rationalization. Until they can prove miracles happen, and those miracles are a product of an actual God, much less their own personal God, this is just a complete waste of time. The argument from the hard problem of consciousness. Premise 1. The hard problem of consciousness consists in our difficulty in explaining why it subjectively feels like something to be a functioning brain. Premise 2. Consciousness is not a complex phenomena built out of simpler ones. It can consist of irreducible raw feels like seeing red or tasting salt. Premise 3. Science explains complex phenomena by reducing them to simpler ones, and reducing them to still simpler ones until the simplest one is explained by the basic laws of physics. Premise 4. The basic laws of physics describe the properties of the elemental constituents of matter and energy, like quarks and quanta, which are not conscious. Premise 5. Science cannot derive consciousness by reducing it to basic physical laws about the elementary constituents of matter and energy from 2, 3, and 4. Premise 6. Science will never solve the hard problem of consciousness from 3 and 5. Premise 7. The explanation for consciousness must lie beyond physical laws from 6. Premise 8. Consciousness, lying outside of physical laws, must itself be immaterial from 7. Premise 9. God is immaterial for some reason that they just pulled out of their ass. Premise 10. Consciousness and God both partake in the same immaterial kind of being from 8 and 9. Premise 11. God has not only the means to impart consciousness to us, but also the motive, namely to allow us to enjoy a good life and to make it possible for our choices to cause or prevent suffering in others, therefore allowing for morality and meaning. That was long. Premise 12. Consciousness can only be explained by positing that God inserted a spark of the divine into us from 7, 10, and 11. Therefore, God exists. Alright, this whole argument rests on a very poor understanding of how science actually functions, which I guess is no surprise. In fact, if we look at premise 2, we see just how poor this understanding actually is. We don't actually see red. Our eyes perceive a particular wavelength of light, which our conscious mind identifies arbitrarily as red, based on the system of color names that people have invented for such things. If you don't even understand that, then complex philosophy is way beyond you. What irreducible complexity really means, whether they want to admit it or not, is they want to dumb complex ideas down to such a degree that even they can get it through their tiny little brains. And I'm sorry, but reality doesn't operate that way. And of course, when you get to premise 9, they're just back to defining God into existence, simply arbitrarily defining God's characteristics because it helps solve the problem. But how do they know that God is immaterial? How do they know anything about God? They don't. And premises 10 and 11 are just bald assertion, and 12 is so far off the reservation, it's ridiculous. I trust you see just how bad all of these arguments actually are, and how absurd the supposed reasoning behind them can be. The argument from the improbable self. Premise 1. I exist in all my particularity and contingency, not as a generic example of personhood, not as any old member of Homo sapiens, but as the unique conscious entity that I know as me. Premise 2. I can step outside myself and view my own contingent particularity with astonishment. Premise 3. This astonishment reveals that there must be something that accounts for why, out of all the particular things that I could have been, I am just this, namely me, from 1 and 2. Premise 4. Nothing within the world can account for why I am just this, since the laws of the world are generic. They can explain why certain kinds of things came to be, even, let's assume, why human beings with conscious brains came to be, but nothing in the world can explain why one of those human beings should be me. Premise 5. Only something outside the world who cares about me can therefore account for why I'm just this, from 4. Premise 6. God is the only thing outside the world who cares about each and every one of us. Therefore, God exists. All right, this is dumb. This is just dumb. Premise 1 is a personal subjective take on what is really an objective fact. What you know as you isn't what you really are. You are just any old member of Homo sapiens sapiens. You are not objectively special. You may want to believe that you are, but you're not. You are made of the same 3 billion base pairs of DNA as everyone else. You are not magical. This is just part of an argument from personal incredulity, where you want to accept an idea because it appeals to you on a personal level or because the alternative is difficult to accept for personal emotional reasons. And I think you start to see why some of these arguments never get brought up by the religious, because many of them are just so idiotic on their face that any theist who trotted one of these out would get immediately laughed into oblivion. Because the argument from, I want to be special, isn't a good argument at all. It's an emotional problem. Why should we be impressed with that? The argument from survival after death. Premise 1. There is empirical evidence that people survive after death. Well, no, there isn't, but we'll come back to that. Patients who flatline during medical emergencies report an experience of floating over their bodies and seeing glimpses of a passage to another world, and can accurately report what happened around their bodies while they were dead to the world. Premise 2. A person's consciousness can survive after the death of his or her body from 1. Premise 3. Survival after death entails the existence of an immaterial soul. Premise 4. The immaterial soul exists, from 2 and 3. Premise 5. If an immaterial soul exists, then God must exist. Therefore, God exists. All right. Speaking of stupid arguments, this one is pretty hard to top. First off, as I said, premise 1 is simply false. While people who come close to death often come back with stories about things that they've seen, the reality is we understand exactly what's going on biologically, and it has nothing at all to do with the so-called other side. We know that loss of oxygen to the eye can cause tunnel vision. When the body starts to shut down, it releases huge amounts of steroids, epinephrine, and adrenaline, which explains feelings of euphoria and hallucinations. Your brain dumps memories in an attempt to make room for important new information coming in, and because our memory is tied so strongly to the fight or flight response, that's why whatever hallucinations happen are so vividly remembered. But because people have no real idea what's going on in their bodies, they invent fanciful notions and supernatural explanations for what are entirely physical and understandable events. And it all turns into yet another argument from ignorance. I don't get it, therefore God. But that's pretty much all of these idiotic arguments, isn't it? The argument from the inconceivability of personal annihilation. Premise 1. I cannot conceive of my own annihilation. As soon as I start to think about what it would be like not to exist, I am thinking, which implies that I would not be thinking about what it would be like not to exist. Premise 2. My annihilation is inconceivable, from 1. Premise 3. What cannot be conceived cannot be. Premise 4. I cannot be annihilated, from 2 and 3. Premise 5. I survive after my death, from 4. Therefore God exists. Now, how God exists comes out of any of this, I don't know, but this is just your basic argument from ignorance. Here we're back to the ever popular argument of personal incredulity. I don't like the idea of ceasing to exist, thus it can't be real. But guess what? What you like or don't like doesn't mean a damn thing. Premise 3 is laughably absurd. People 200 years ago could never have conceived of computers, yet here we are using them every single day. So just because you cannot or do not want to believe something happens, that has no bearing on whether or not it actually does. This whole argument is dumb from beginning to end. The argument from moral truth. Premise 1. There exists objective moral truths, such as slavery and torture and genocide, are not just distasteful to us, but they are actually wrong. Premise 2. These objective moral truths are not grounded in the way the world is, but rather in the way that the world ought to be. Premise 3. The world itself, the way that it is, the laws of science that explain why it is that way, cannot account for the way that the world ought to be. Premise 4. The only way to account for morality is that God established morality, from 2 and 3, therefore God exists. All right, premise 1 is just wrong. This is just argument by assertion. And it's funny that they brought up slavery, because just a couple of hundred years ago, not only was slavery seen as an objective moral good, it was Christianity that taught that it was. Moral views change over time. They change all the time. What we see as moral today will invariably be seen as horribly immoral in the future. And because premise 1 is so ridiculous, the rest falls apart. When you get to premise 3, which is a perfect example of Hume's is-ought problem, where Hume argued that far too many people look at what is, and then they try to extend that to what they think ought to be, which is philosophically and intellectually irrational, the further we go on, the more we see that these arguments are just fallacy stacked on fallacy stacked on fallacy, until you're playing musical chairs to see which fallacy is more fallacious than the next. I'm really not sure how these arguments convince anyone, which, let's be honest, they don't, because they're not meant to convince the faithful. They're meant to comfort people who already believe by rationalizing their way to beliefs that these arguments would never convince anyone of. The argument from altruism. Premise 1. People often act altruistically, namely against their interests. They help others at a cost to themselves out of empathy, fairness, decency, and integrity. Premise 2. Natural selection can never favor true altruism because genes for selfishness will always outcompete genes for altruism. Recall that altruism, by definition, exacts a cost to the actor. Premise 3. Only a force acting outside of natural selection and intending for us to be moral could account for our ability to act altruistically from 2. Premise 4. God is the only force outside of natural selection that could intend for us to be moral. Premise 5. God must have implanted the moral instinct within us from 3 and 4. Therefore God exists. Again, I'm going to disagree with the very first premise because I don't think anyone acts entirely altruistically at all. They always get something out of it, even if it's just a dopamine hit to the brain or the belief that people will remember them as a hero. And premise 2 is wrong because evolution can and does reward sacrificial behavior, especially when they're doing it to protect their children, family, or tribe. Premise 3 is pulled right out of their theological ass, and this continues to premise 4, which is a bald assertion that cannot be rationally justified. You might as well say that Harry Potter is the only force outside of natural selection that could intend for us to be immoral. Why not? It's just as provable. And into the home stretch we go, with the expected argument from ignorance. I don't know, so God did it. Honestly, are we going to get anywhere near any kind of functional logic anytime soon? They have to do better than this. I mean, it's kind of hard to do any worse, isn't it? And finally, the argument from free will. Premise 1. Having free will means the freedom to choose our actions rather than their being determined by some prior cause. Premise 2. If we don't have free will, then we are not agents, for then we are not really acting, but rather we're being acted upon. That's why we don't punish people for involuntary actions, such as a teller who hands money to a bank robber at gunpoint, or a driver who injures a pedestrian after a defective tire blows out. Premise 3. To be a moral agent means to be held morally responsible for what one does. Premise 4. If we can't be held morally responsible for anything that we do, then the very idea of morality is meaningless. Premise 5. Morality is not meaningless. Premise 6. We have free will from 2 to 5. Premise 7. We as moral agents are not subject to the laws of nature, in particular, the neural events in a genetically and environmentally determined brain from 1 and 6. Premise 8. Only a being who is apart from the laws of nature and partake in the moral sphere could explain our being moral agents from 7. Premise 9. Only God is a being who is apart from the laws of nature and partakes of the moral sphere. Premise 10. Only God can explain our moral agency from 8 and 9. Therefore God exists. And yeah, because God's omniscience clearly destroys free will, Because God, according to the religious at least, knows with perfect clarity everything that will ever happen, and God can never be wrong. And if that's true, then our actions cannot, by definition, be free, and this entire argument goes the way of the dodo. It has to, which is why the religious, when using this argument, do their damnedest to avoid talking about divine omniscience. Try getting into a debate with a theist on this, and they will run around in the most ridiculous circles to avoid dealing with that contradiction. The most popular argument I've seen is that God knows everything because God is timeless and has seen history from the end point of history, thus he knows what we will do, he didn't force us to do it. Except if we're incapable of doing something that God hasn't foreseen, then we have no free will by definition. We're just robots programmed by God or history or by whatever to do what we have to do with no real choice in the matter. Once that information is in our time, we are bound by it. All right, I know what happened in the Civil War because I've studied history. But if I went back in time to the Civil War and they had to do what I knew they would, then in that moment, they would have no free will. Absolutely not. So this just falls apart. And then we get back to a bunch of empty assertions as usual, none of which can be demonstrated to be reasonable and hence implode under the weight of their own stupidity. Does this convince anyone? I have no idea, but it shouldn't because it's just philosophically empty. So that's the second set of 10 out of our list of bad apologetic arguments. Do you think they're getting any better or are they getting worse? Have you seen a single one that stands up to any kind of rational scrutiny? Yeah, me either. These are really, really dumb arguments, made not to appeal to the skeptics because, like me, the skeptics will see right through them. No, they're intended to appeal to the already religious who just want to think that they have some good arguments, and it's somehow the non-religious who are the unreasonable ones in their demands for something better than this. But if this is the best they've got, then we're perfectly justified to laugh, shake our heads, and walk away. These arguments are just that bad, and I have a feeling they're going to keep going downhill before we see anything that a reasonable or rational person might consider seriously. So, what is the worst argument out of all of this set? Let me know in the comments. Or maybe the best, if anything really qualifies as best. Less worse? I don't know. Share with the class. Honestly, I don't think that any of these can be improved without gutting the entire God proposition. They are fundamentally flawed, and they can't be fixed. So let's see what the next 10 bring. Better? Worse? I guess it really doesn't matter. They're all just asinine rationalizations anyhow. Argument number 21. The argument from personal purpose. Premise 1. If there is no purpose to a person's life, then that person's life is pointless. Premise 2. Human life cannot be pointless. Premise 3. Each human life has a purpose from 1 and 2. Premise 4. The purpose of each individual person's life must derive from the overall purpose of existence. Premise 5. There is an overall purpose of existence from 3 and 4. Premise 6. Only God can provide an overall purpose to a human life. Therefore, God exists. Now, of course, this is just silly, and the premises are absurd. This is really why philosophical arguments of this kind are so utterly laughable. So, we'll start with premise 1. If there is no purpose to a person's life, then that person's life is pointless. Okay, so? And whose job is it to give their life meaning? Their own. So if they fail to do so, whose fault is it? Their own. But as we move on to premise 2, it gets even more ridiculous. Human life cannot be pointless. Says who? That's not a premise, it's a bald assertion, and a false one at that. Why can't human life be pointless? Because that makes some people uncomfortable, I guess. Well, screw them. And it goes downhill from there with even more empty claims based on preconceived notions, ending up with more ad hoc nonsense. But that's how all of these arguments end up, isn't it? Entirely unimpressive. And none of it proves that God exists because, as we see in premise 6, it just baldly asserts that only God can provide an overall purpose to human life. That's false. I've got a fine purpose to my life. I came up with it. I don't need the help of any imaginary friends. So this is just absurdly stupid. Number 22. The argument from the intolerability of insignificance. Premise 1. In a million years, nothing that happens now will matter. Premise 2. By the same token, anything that happens at any point in time will not matter from the point of view of some other time a million years distant into the future. Premise 3. No point in time can confer mattering on any other point, for each suffers from the same problem of not mattering itself from 2. Premise 4. It is intolerable or inconceivable or unacceptable that in a million years, nothing that happens now will matter. Premise 5. What happens now will matter in a million years from 4. Premise 6. It is only from the point of view of eternity that what happens now will matter even in a million years from 3. Premise 7. Only God can inhabit the point of view of eternity. Therefore, this is stupid. No, therefore, God exists. All right. Like the last argument, which is really just an emotional reaction, this one is every bit as bad. So what if people don't want to be insignificant? Too bad, so sad, get over yourself. The only thing that actually matters is reality, and in reality, we are insignificant, at least from a vast perspective, because we're just an insignificant life form on an insignificant planet, in an insignificant solar system, in the ass end of an insignificant galaxy. If there's other life out there somewhere, chances are they not only have no idea we exist, they probably never will. When we're gone, and we will be gone, no one will miss us. From a cosmic perspective, we're pathetically irrelevant, and if this bothers you, that means you're not an intellectual adult. This whole argument essentially says, reality doesn't make me happy, therefore God exists. Too bad! I trust I don't have to point out just how absurdly stupid this is. Premise 4 points it all out. It is intolerable. Yeah? To who? Because it isn't intolerable to me. Your feelings don't dictate reality. And this just shows that believers aren't thinking about reality at all. The lives of billions of people who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago, they've all been entirely forgotten. Up until we started keeping decent birth records, there are hundreds of millions of people or more that we have no idea ever existed at all. And you know something? Who cares? So what? It doesn't keep me from sleeping at night, and I suspect the religious don't care either, because ultimately we are all insignificant to everyone but ourselves and to our loved ones. None of this says anything about God. Number 23. The argument from the consensus of humanity. Premise 1. Every culture in every epoch has had theistic beliefs. Premise 2. When peoples widely separated by both time and space hold similar beliefs, the best explanation is that those beliefs are true. Okay. Premise 3. The best explanation for why every culture has had theistic beliefs is that those beliefs are true. Therefore, God exists. These don't get any smarter, do they? All right. Here's the fact. Those beliefs are often not at all similar. And especially today, when people are giving up religious beliefs entirely, when we're seeing entire countries with a majority of atheists that reject the belief in gods, this whole thing falls apart. And we can apply this to every absurd belief that man has ever held. Just because people believe it, that doesn't make it true. Most people believed that the earth was flat. Some morons still do, but science proved all of them wrong. Their beliefs were false no matter how many people held them. And this is just a giant argumentum ad populum fallacy. Short and sweet, this one is just idiotic. 24. The argument from the consensus of mystics. Oh boy, this is going to be good. Premise 1. Mystics go into a special state in which they seem to see aspects of reality that elude everyday experience. Premise 2. We cannot evaluate the truth of their experiences from the viewpoint of everyday experience from 1. Premise 3. There is a consensus among mystics as to what they experience. Premise 4. When there is consensus among observers as to what they experience, then unless they're all deluded in the same way, the best explanation for their consensus is that their experiences are true. Premise 5. There's no reason to think that mystics are all deluded in the same way, although they can all be deluded in different ways, but we're not going to talk about that. Premise 6. The best explanation for the conformity of mystical experience is that what mystics perceive is true from 4 and 5. Number 7. Mystical experiences unanimously testify to the transcendent presence of God. Therefore, God exists. I don't know. Okay. Again, this is just an assertion made with no corroboratory evidence. Mystics aren't real. Yes, there are people who pretend to be mystics. There are people who claim to be mystics, but there has never been any actual demonstrated mystics. People who actually demonstrably see things that we can verify that they've actually seen or that are actually so. And this is why so-called mystics have typically used some kind of mind-altering drugs. The key is in the word. Mind-altering. That doesn't mean that you see anything real. It means that these drugs mess with your brain's ability to accurately process information. So they come back from their drug trip not knowing what actually happened to them, which is more often the case, or just not caring what happened to them. It doesn't matter to them that their neurons are misfiring. They see pretty colors and they have weird memories, and all of a sudden, they're a mystic. No, they're a moron. And none of that proves the existence of a God. Number 25. The argument from holy books. Premise 1. There are holy books that reveal the Word of God. Premise 2. The Word of God is necessarily true. Premise 3. The Word of God reveals the existence of God. Therefore, God exists. It's hard to overstate how stupid this actually is. Again, this is just bald assertions that can't be validated. Premise 1 betrays the irrationality of the religious. Holy books claim to reveal the Word of God. They cannot be demonstrated to actually do so. So premise 1 kills the entire argument because it's demonstrably false. It doesn't prove a thing. It just claims to be true. It cannot be shown to be actually true. Seriously, how can you get more dumb than this? But after going through 25 so far, isn't this pretty much how most of these absurd arguments work? Argument number 26. The argument from perfect justice. Premise 1. This world provides numerous instances of imperfect justice. Bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people. Premise 2. It violates our sense of justice that imperfect justice may prevail. Premise 3. There must be a transcendent realm in which perfect justice prevails from 1 and 2. Premise 4. A transcendent realm in which perfect justice prevails entails the perfect judge. Premise 5, the perfect judge is God, therefore, God exists. These don't get any better, do they? This is just another case where reality hurts our feelings, therefore reality has to be wrong. Yes, there is imperfect justice. What of it? Yes, bad people get away with doing bad things. So what? The fact that you don't like it doesn't change the fact that it happens. This is yet another entirely emotional argument that falls apart under the damning light of reason. Some people don't like reality, therefore God. But it doesn't work that way. Sometimes bad people do bad things and get away with it. It happens. We try to limit that, but we can't stop it entirely. And it doesn't matter how much that bothers you. It has been and will continue to be true. Making up a magical man in the sky and an eternal damnation for people you don't like, that doesn't change anything. That's why all of these bad arguments for the existence of God fail, because you start with ideas based solely on emotion, really want them to be true, and then demand that somehow that proves God is real. And it does nothing of the sort. They all take on the form of something I really wish was true must be true, therefore all the things that I believe for bad reasons must be so, therefore God. Sorry, you're wrong. Number 27, the argument from suffering, which sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Premise 1. There is much suffering in this world. Now, something must have gone wrong here because we're missing premise 2, but I guess we can all just mentally move everything up one spot. So, everybody pretend, just like the religious. Premise 3. Some suffering, or at least its possibility, is demanded by human moral agency. If people could not choose evil acts that cause suffering, moral choice would not exist. Premise 4. Whatever suffering cannot be explained as the result of human moral agency must also have some purpose from 2 and 3. Well, there is no... Where's 2? I don't get 2. Never mind. Premise 5. There are virtues, forbearance, courage, compassion, and so on, that can only develop in the presence of suffering. We call them the virtues of suffering. Premise 6. Some suffering has the purpose of our developing the virtues of suffering from 5. Premise 7. Even taking 3 and 6 into account, the amount of suffering in the world is still enormous, far more than what is required for us to benefit from suffering. Premise 8. Moreover, there are those who suffer who can never develop the virtues of suffering, children, animals, and those who perish in their agony. Premise 9. There is more suffering than we can possibly explain by reference to the purposes that we can discern from 7 and 8. Premise 10. There are purposes for suffering that we cannot discern from the non-existent 2 and 9. Something really has to be missing there. Premise 11. Only a being who has a sense of purpose beyond ours could provide the purpose of all suffering from 10. Premise 12. Only God could have a sense of purpose beyond ours. Therefore, yada yada yada, God exists. Alright. This argument fails for exactly the same reasons that the free will arguments fail. Because free will and moral agency only operate among available choices. If there was no such thing as evil, then humans would have every bit the moral agency they do now, with all the choices that they had available to them. So, assuming that there's a God, which is a bad assumption, but assuming that there is, then it's the fault of that God for setting up the system the way that he did and not having the imagination to make a vastly superior system for us to live in. It all comes down to God being an uncreative prick. But the religious refuse to acknowledge that, therefore they cast it not as a bug, but as a feature. This is true because the religious aren't that creative or imaginative either. They lack the ability to think beyond what we see to what could conceivably be. given their belief in an all-powerful deity that could do absolutely anything without limitation. And of course, as you read through the argument, it's chock full of empty claims that do not stand up to rational evaluation. Why is God the only one that could have a sense of purpose beyond ours? Where the hell did they get that idea? Because it isn't about finding the truth, it's about confirming the pre-existing biases. So this whole thing is just a waste of time. Number 28. The argument from the survival of the Jews. This is going to be good. Premise 1. The Jews introduced the world to the idea of one God with his universal moral code, which unfortunately isn't true, but, won't go there. Number 2, the survival of the Jews, living for millennia without a country of their own and facing a multitude of enemies that sought to destroy not only their religion, but all remnants of the race, is a historical unlikelihood. Premise 3, the Jews have survived against vast odds, from 2. Premise 4, there is no natural explanation for so unlikely an event as the survival of the Jews, from 3. Premise 5, the best explanation is that they have some kind of transcendent purpose to play in human destiny, from 1 and 4. Premise 6, only God could have assigned a transcendent destiny to the Jews, therefore God exists. Alright, actually, the Jews did nothing of the sort. There were other monotheistic religions around. It's likely that Zoroastrianism is the first, but we really can't say for certain, but it is absolutely older than Judaism. Besides, it doesn't really matter who's the first. It matters who's correct. And obviously, Christians don't think the Jews are right, because otherwise they wouldn't be Christians. Now, I don't want to get into the whole reasons why, at least in the broad strokes, the Jews have deserved a lot of what happened to them, even if in a lot of cases they were forced into a position where others hated them. I'm not playing the, ha-ha, you got what you deserved card. I mean, this isn't any kind of a crazy anti-Semitic thing. They were cast in the role of money handlers, and they were really good at it. And therefore everybody hated their guts. And of course, the whole Jesus killer thing, yeah, that really didn't help out. It happens. It sucks, but it happens. None of this actually proves anything. Certainly not that any gods exist. This is just an argument from ignorance. They don't get it, therefore God. And that still isn't rational, and why this argument, like all others, just falls apart completely. Number 29. The argument from the upward curve of history. Premise 1. There is an upward moral curve to human history. Tyrannies fall, the evil side loses in major wars, democracy, freedom, and civil rights spread. Premise 2. Natural selection's favoring of those who are fittest to compete for resources and mates has bequeathed humankind selfish and aggressive traits. Premise 3. Left to their own devices, a selfish and aggressive species would not have ascended up a moral curve over the course of history, from 2. Premise 4. Only God has the power and the concern for us to curve history upwards. Therefore, God exists. Okay. Another failure. Premise 1 is all subjective. Tyrannies fall, but only because they rose in the first place, and there are a lot of tyrannies on the rise all the time. We tend to forget the bad things in our midst. Evil loses only because the winners write the history books and cast the losing side as evil. Good and evil are entirely subjective concepts. Democracy is tenuous at best. All one has to do is study politics to know that. Freedom and civil rights spread, well, not if you look at Europe right now. It's becoming more and more limited. The police in England are spending a ton of time trying to prosecute free speech online, at least speech that the liberal government doesn't like. And the same is true throughout Germany and France and other European countries. And that's to say nothing of what is going on in China, because there, freedom doesn't really exist. And let's not forget the leftists in the US who are desperately trying to control what people can say based on feelings. And religious regimes, notably in Russia and the Middle East, are actively trying to harm people who speak out against their religious beliefs. This is just absurd to anyone who actually knows what they're talking about. And keep in mind that we tend to wrongly assume that whatever moral views we happen to hold today must be the absolute right views, not only for today, but across time. It's why idiots on the far left are out there trying to destroy historical monuments from the past, because their modern moral views insist that the views of the past must have been wrong. And the same goes for religion, which tends to destroy religious monuments of other religions because everyone else must, by definition, be wrong, and that the destroyer's views must be right for all time. Never mind the fact that everyone has always thought that, and their moral ideas have always been supplanted by someone else who was equally convinced that everyone in the past was an immoral monster. So this argument rests on a ridiculously faulty premise, that everyone is right today, and everyone in the past was always wrong. There is no advancement. There is only change. What we do today will be seen by people tomorrow as barbaric. Thus, the whole argument implodes under its own irrationality. And finally, for this time out, number 30, the argument from prodigious genius. Premise 1. Genius is the highest level of creative capacity, the level which, by definition, defies explanation. Except it doesn't, but, Premise 2. Genius does not happen by way of natural psychological processes. From 1. Premise 3. The cause of genius must lie outside of natural psychological processes. From 2. Premise 4. The insights of genius have helped in the cumulative process of humankind, scientific, technological, philosophical, moral, artistic, societal, political, spiritual, yada yada yada. Premise 5. The cause of genius must both lie outside of natural psychological processes and be such as to care about the progress of humankind. From 3 and 4. Premise 6. Only God could work outside of natural psychological processes and create genius to light the path of humankind. Therefore, God exists. Well, finally, we get to the last argument this time around, and again, it rests entirely on subjective views that cannot be objectively verified. It starts off by denying that genius can be explained, which is patently false. We know how it happens. We just can't predict when it happens. Further, calling someone a genius is, by definition, subjective based on what we want to see, not necessarily on what actually is. Genius is also only recognized in retrospect. It has to be proven to solve a problem or to perform in a way people like before they're dubbed a genius. And genius rarely lasts. Newton was a genius right up until Einstein came along, and now there are things that Einstein said that are being proven wrong, and some other genius in the future will say things that supersede him. But beyond all of this, how does God even enter into it? Because this is just another argument from ignorance. These things that people with small minds are confused by need an explanation. Therefore, God. But as I've said many times before, it just doesn't work that way. It never has, and it never will. These aren't getting any better, are they? I keep hoping that they're going to improve. Maybe get the worst ones out of the way first, then get on to something with some real meat. But that's not happening. They are all uniformly terrible, but I suppose that's to be expected. The religious don't care if their views are rational or evidentially supported. They only care if they make them feel good, and that's a piss-poor way of looking at the real world. But this isn't really about the real world, is it? It's about rationalizing your way to emotional comfort, because that's all that matters to them in the end. If you notice, every single one of these so-called philosophical proofs will jump the rational shark somewhere in the middle and declare, without any evidence of any kind, that only God can do whatever it is they're trying to prove, as though an empty claim says anything about the state of reality. You can insert the flying spaghetti monster into every single argument, and it doesn't change the argument any. In the last one, we could say, only the FSM could work outside of natural psychological processes and create geniuses to light the path of humankind. Therefore, the FSM exists. Seriously, put anything in there. Unicorns, leprechauns, it doesn't matter, because these are not supposed to be rational arguments. These are bald-faced rationalizations meant to confirm the already existing biases of the believer. And apparently, they aren't bright enough to see what they're doing. So anyway, next time we'll cover the last 10 of these really terrible arguments for the existence of God. And if anyone wants to put down money that there will be something convincing in that last set, hey, I'll take your bet. Because these reasons are just a joke. If you buy into any of them, there's something wrong with your brain. But that pretty much describes the religious, doesn't it? They have Dane Bramage. Bad argument 31. The argument from human knowledge of infinity. Premise 1. We are finite, and everything with which we come into physical contact is finite. Premise 2. We have a knowledge of the infinite, demonstrably so in mathematics. Premise 3. We could not have derived this knowledge of the infinite from the finite, from anything which we are, and come into contact with, from 1. Premise 4. Only something itself infinite could have implanted knowledge of the infinite in us, from 2 and 3. Premise 5. Only God would want us to have a knowledge of the infinite, both for the cognitive pleasure it affords us, and because it allows us to come to know Him, who is Himself infinite. Premise 6. God is the only entity. These get tiring, don't they? Both that is infinite and that could have an intention of implanting the knowledge of the infinite within us, from 4 and 5. Therefore, God exists. Alright, we actually don't have any knowledge of the infinite because the infinite doesn't actually exist. We can imagine the infinite, just like we can imagine gods and unicorns and leprechauns, things that have already been used in the past to suggest that these things must exist and have been debunked just as quickly. They're getting extremely desperate to try to throw in these silly imagination games. Again, if you notice premise 5 and 6, they just assert that God both wants things and is the only explanation for things, which immediately invalidates the entire argument because it is an irrational and unsupported premise to begin with. At the very end, I'm going to go into why every single one of these religious philosophical claims fails right out of the gate, because the religious have no clue how philosophy actually works. But you're going to have to wait for that. So let's move on. Argument 32. The argument from mathematical reality. Premise 1. Mathematical truths are necessarily true. There is no possible world in which, say, 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, or in which the square root of 2 can be expressed as the ratio of two whole numbers. Premise 2. The truths that describe our physical world, no matter how fundamental, are empirical, requiring observational evidence. So, for example, we await some empirical means to test string theory in order to find out whether we live in a world of 11 dimensions. Premise 3. Truths that require empirical evidence are not necessary truths. We require empirical evidence because there are possible worlds in which these are not truths. So, we have to test that ours is not such a world. Premise 4. The truths of our physical world are not necessary truths, from 2 and 3. Premise 5. The truths of our physical world cannot explain mathematical truths, from 1 and 4. Premise 6. Mathematical truths exist on a different plane of existence from physical truths, from 5. Premise 7. Only something which itself exists on a different plane of existence from the physical can explain mathematical truths. From 6. Premise 8. Only God can explain mathematical truths. From 7. Therefore, God exists. Alright, here the religious demonstrate that not only do they not understand philosophy, they don't understand mathematics either. Math is something that we made up. It's a means of working out both the abstract and the real in numerical form. It is a language only because we invented it as such. So in premise 1, 2 plus 2 only equals 4 because we arbitrarily defined it as such. In an earlier video, I went into this in more depth, that 2 has no inherent value, only the value that we assign to it, because 2 is just a word, a concept that we made up, and there are plenty of other words in other languages that can take the place of 2 and mean the same thing. All of these things exist only in the heads of humanity. If we went extinct, mathematics as we know it, as we've defined it, that would die as well, left behind only in dusty tomes and dry mathematical textbooks, at least until those crumbled to dust. If there are aliens out there, they may have come up with their own form of mathematics, using their own terminology and ideas, but it will be their own. This really illustrates that the religious are just in love with humanity and think that we're magically special when, in reality, we're not. Just because we thought it up doesn't make it gospel truth. In fact, mathematical ideas, like scientific ones, change all the time as we realize that our current system isn't adequate to describe whatever it is we're trying to describe. Mathematicians are constantly tweaking equations and devising new forms of math that work better than what we currently have on hand. It's sad that the religious apologists don't recognize how these things work in reality. And of course, you get the declaration at the end that only God can explain it all. Says who? Because that's a constant problem that the religious refuse to correct. They care only about getting to their preconceived beliefs, not in making rational sense. Number 33. The argument from decision theory, otherwise known as Pascal's wager. These are always good. Premise 1. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Premise 2. A person can either believe that God exists or believe that God doesn't exist. From 1. Premise 3. If God exists and you believe, you receive eternal salvation. Premise 4. If God exists and you don't believe, you receive eternal damnation. Premise 5. If God doesn't exist and you believe, you've been duped. You've wasted time in religious observance and you've missed out on decadent enjoyments. Premise 6. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe, then you've avoided a false belief. Premise 7. You have much more to gain by believing in God than not believing in Him, and much more to lose by not believing in God than believing in Him. From 3, 4, 5, and 6. Conclusion, it is more rational to believe that God exists than to believe that He doesn't exist. From 7. Yeah, we eventually had to get to Pascal's wager. This is a well-known fallacious argument that doesn't actually get anyone anywhere, but it gets trotted out all the time. So let's unpack this mess and see where it fails. Premise 3 is where it all starts to go south because it makes a claim that cannot be validated. Which God? There are many thousands of gods that man has invented for himself to bow down to over the years, and this doesn't take into account the potentially billions of gods that we haven't even dreamed up. And this whole thing assumes, again without evidence, that the Christian theology has got it all right, that whatever is written in the Bible is true, and that there is an eternal salvation awaiting believers. None of this can be demonstrated to be so. So, premise 3 and 4, they're unproven at best and ridiculously laughable unless you hold the preconceived notion that Christianity must be right. And which version of Christianity might that be? Because there's more than 42,000 distinct sects of Christianity out there, and none of them agree. But where this entire argument fails is when you get to premise 5, because it doesn't recognize that the options are not the Christian God or no God at all. But there could be any of a near infinite number of potential gods out there, gods we may have come up with, and gods we may never have dreamed of. If the god of the Aztecs is real, Christians are screwed. The odds that Christians have arbitrarily picked the correct god among the millions and millions of potential gods is absurdly low. You have a better chance of winning the lottery 50 times in a row. So this stops being a simple odds game in favor of the Christians and starts being a matter of going where the actual evidence leads, something that's simply not on the side of the religious. If there were, say, 100 potential gods, Christians have a 99% chance of winding up in some deity's version of whatever kind of hell, being punished for all eternity. When there are 100 million potential gods or more, the odds become vanishingly small that they somehow got it right. At worst, atheists are in the same boat, but at least we used our critical faculties in the only life we demonstrably had and maintained our intellectual integrity. At best, we didn't waste our lives in meaningless religious rituals. We hopefully actually accomplished something. Given the two options, I pick the skeptical position every time. Argument 34. The argument from pragmatism, otherwise known as William James's leap of faith. Premise 1. The consequences for the believer's life of believing should be considered as part of the evidence for the truth of the belief, just as the effectiveness of a scientific theory in its practical applications is considered evidence for the truth of the theory. Call this the pragmatic evidence for the belief. Premise 2. Certain beliefs affect a change for the better in the believer's life, the necessary condition being that they are believed. Premise 3. The belief in God is a belief that affects a change for the better in a person's life. Premise 4. If one tries to decide whether or not to believe in God based on the evidence available, one will never get the chance to evaluate the pragmatic evidence for the beneficial consequences of believing in God, from 2 and 3. Conclusion: one ought to make the leap of faith, the term is James's, and believe in God, and only then evaluate the evidence, from 1 and 4. Yeah, oh good. The fallacious appeal to consequences, not caring whether a proposition is true or not, only whether or not the potential, and in this case imaginary consequences, are emotionally comforting or not. Of course, this is filled to the brim with more irrational and unsupported claims because atheists, too, will tell you that rejecting irrational religion is one of the best things they ever did, and their lives are infinitely improved by that single act. And of course, this is just trying to sidestep the truth value of the belief by specifically telling people to embrace the emotional impact a belief might have on you. Because who cares about the facts anyway, right? Further, I would question whether belief in an imaginary man in the sky actually does make anyone's life better. Atheists will tell you of the long-term damage that a belief in hellfire will do to you once you realize what a load of bunk it all is. That is not a positive for the religious side. It is mental torture, often visited upon innocent children when they are at their most vulnerable. I don't think this argument stands up to a moment's rational criticism. Number 35. The argument from the unreasonableness of reason. I can't make these up, people. Sorry. Premise 1. Our belief in reason cannot be justified by reason, since that would be circular. Premise 2. Our belief in reason must be accepted on faith, from 1. Premise 3. Every time we exercise reason, we are exercising faith, from 2. Premise 4. Faith provides good rational grounds for beliefs, since it is, in its final analysis, necessary even for the belief in reason, from 3. Premise 5. We are justified in using faith for any belief that is so important to our lives that not believing it would render us incoherent, from 4. All right. Premise 6. We cannot avoid faith in God if we are to live coherent, moral, and purposeful lives. Premise 7. We are justified in believing that God exists, from 5 and 6. Therefore, God exists. This is a good one. It's unreasonable to be reasonable. Therefore, jettison reason and just be unreasonable because reasons. An argument using philosophy, which is supposed to be a reasonable and rational means of evaluating arguments, at least if you use it correctly. This is fallacious all over the place. It's an appeal to emotions, to consequences, to ignorance, and it doesn't actually prove anything because it's saying not to care if gods exist, therefore, apparently, gods exist. This one doesn't pop up that often, probably because it's so absurdly idiotic, but it really isn't any worse than the rest of these awful arguments for the existence of God. It's just easier to see the irrationality here. We're getting into the home stretch with number 36, the argument from sublimity. Premise 1. There are experiences that are windows into the wholeness of existence, its grandeur, beauty, symmetry, harmony, unity, even its goodness. Premise 2. We glimpse a benign transcendence in these moments. Premise 3. Only God could provide us with a glimpse of benign transcendence. Therefore, God exists. Alright, this is yet another emotional appeal. We see things that appeal to us on an emotional level. The religious have a vested interest in assigning that fact to their imaginary friends. Therefore, their imaginary friends exist. I trust I don't have to explain why this is every bit as dumb as it sounds, do I? Because whether the religious want to admit it or not, all of these experiences can easily be explained by evolution and don't require their imaginary friend at all. There is nothing demonstrably transcendent in any of these experiences. They just cause a trigger of specific chemicals that produce specific feelings in our brains. No gods required. It is the epitome of feels over reals. This is not something that a rational person should be swayed by. Number 37. The argument from the intelligibility of the world, Spinoza's God. Premise 1. All facts must have explanations. Premise 2. The fact that there's a universe at all, and that it is this universe with just these laws of nature, has an explanation, from 1. Premise 3. There must, in principle, be a theory of everything that explains why this universe with these laws of nature exists, from 2. Note that this premise should not be interpreted as entailing that we have the capacity to come up with a theory of everything. It may elude the cognitive abilities that we have. Then why did you bring it up? Premise 4. If the theory of everything explains everything, it explains why there is a theory of everything. Premise 5. The only way that a theory of everything could explain why it is the theory of everything is if it is itself necessarily true, i.e., true in all possible worlds. Premise 6. The theory of everything is necessarily true, from 4 and 5. Premise 7. The universe, understood in terms of the theory of everything, exists necessarily and explains itself, from 6. Premise 8. That which exists necessarily and explains itself is God, a definition of God, which, isn't what anybody's talking about. Premise 9. The universe is God, from 7 and 8. Therefore, God exists. Alright, this one requires a lot of unpacking because I guess at first blush it might sound remotely reasonable, especially since scientists often talk about finding the grand theory of everything, a unifying theory that explains absolutely everything that we observe. It's a comforting thought that you will just find one thing that will explain everything. But in reality, that's probably not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. So this theoretical and fanciful theory of everything proposed here, it's really just a fantasy, and the argument is therefore based on fantasy thinking. But this doesn't actually lead anywhere useful because it takes some real liberties with logic that can't be justified. First off, the universe itself is not necessary. It's here certainly, but there's no reason why it needs to be here. People just like to think like they were planned, that it was inevitable that they were here, but that's not the case. We're here because the conditions of the universe are such as to support the evolution of our form of life. We're nothing special. We never were, and we never will be. And of course, even if you want to pretend that the universe must have necessarily come into existence for some indemonstrable reason, there's no reason to call the universe God. We've already got a perfectly good word for the universe, that being universe. There's no need to bring in an emotionally charged word that adds nothing at all to the conversation. Spinoza's God is pantheistic, but as I've shown in other videos, pantheism really gets you nowhere. It does away with all of the personal gods that care what you do in the bedroom and how many times you bow down in a certain direction every day, and that might be its only saving grace, to get rid of those idiotic ideas. But otherwise, what does this give us that just acknowledging a naturalistic universe doesn't? Emotional comfort? Well, that's only needed by the intellectually weak and critically uncivilized. Why bother with that at all? It makes no sense. And finally, number 38, the worst one there is, the argument from the abundance of arguments. Premise 1. The more arguments there are for a proposition, the more confidence we should have in it, even if every argument is imperfect. Science itself proceeds by accumulating evidence, each piece by itself being inconclusive. Premise 2. There is not just one argument for the existence of God, but many. 38 in this list alone. Premise 3. The arguments, though not flawless, are persuasive enough that they have convinced billions of people, and for millennia have been taken seriously by history's greatest minds. Premise 4. The probability that each one is true must be significantly greater than 0 from 3. Premise 5. For God not to exist, every single one of the arguments for his existence must be false, which is extremely unlikely from 4. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that each argument has an average probability of only 0.2 being true. Then the probability of all 38 being false is 0.0004, an extremely low probability. Therefore, it is extremely probable that God exists from 5. Alright, finally we come to the stupidest argument in this whole list. The argument that says because there are so many arguments, the very existence of a lot of arguments proves that the arguments must be true. This is about as dumb as saying that because every culture has tales of dragons, therefore dragons are real. This laughable mess tries an appeal to authority, saying that history's greatest minds have taken at least some of these arguments seriously, which is irrelevant because that's a fallacious appeal. Just because a lot of people believe something doesn't make it true. It is true if and only if it is actually demonstrably true and defensible with evidence. None of these ridiculous arguments are. Besides, it ignores all of the great minds that have rejected these arguments as absurd, those who have recognized the fallacious nature of each and every single one of these stupid claims. It also pretends, for the sake of argument, although it's never justified at all, that each argument has an equal chance of being true, which, as I've shown, most of them have virtually no chance at all of actually being so. It attaches a purely invented 0.2 chance, which comes right out of thin air, and then pretends that somehow that's impressive, that there's this low probability that all of these arguments are wrong. But it never addresses the likely lower percentage that even a single one of them is right. The problem with all of these arguments is that the religious have no idea how philosophy works. They don't even philosophy, bro. Because of this, none of these arguments actually work. There are two things that you have to consider when talking about philosophical arguments. First is using proper syllogistic form, and that goes back to Aristotle, who said that if you take a major premise, which is a general statement accepted to be true, add it to a minor premise, which is a specific statement which is also generally accepted to be true, then you can deduce a conclusion from those two premises. If we look at a simple example of this, we can take a three-line syllogism that says, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And this is true if and only if the premises are true. If all men are mortal, and if Socrates is a man, then yes, it follows that Socrates must be mortal. This is a valid conclusion drawn from valid premises. But what if we mix it up a little and say, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore all men are Socrates? This is not a valid conclusion to come to because the conclusion does not arise from the premises. Even if the premises are correct, as they are here, the conclusion is wrong because it isn't logically consistent. And if you look at the religious arguments, they all look more like the second example than the first, and they're therefore all fallacious. And that's really what logical fallacies tell us. They explain how bad logic can result in faulty conclusions, which is every single religious argument ever made. The other thing that you'll notice, which I pointed out many times throughout these terrible arguments, is that they simply throw in bald assertions that they want to think are true, but which cannot be demonstrated to be true, thus invalidating the whole thing. Typically, this has been the only God can whatever line that they put in towards the end of the syllogism. That's not a premise, that's a claim. Whether the religious like it or not, faith and facts are not one and the same thing. Just because you want it to be true, that doesn't mean that it is true. The second you start seeing that, you can pretty much dismiss the entire argument as faulty on its face. If you can fill in those blanks with absolutely anything and not significantly change the argument, it's not a valid premise. In every single one of those, you can insert my ass in place of God, and it doesn't mean anything different. Only my ass can, it's just dumb. So yeah, it's a total waste of time, and pretty much all of these arguments fall because of it. Ultimately, this whole thing is pointless because you can't use philosophy to find out anything or defend anything that exists in reality. It is not possible to use philosophical arguments to discover a new species of sloth or defend the speed of light. Those are things that fall outside of the purview of philosophical thought, and therefore all of the logical syllogisms in the world, they don't get you anywhere useful. And because they're trying to define God into existence, they immediately remove themselves from the philosophical realm. They are using the wrong tool for the job because the right tool for the job says they're out of their ever-loving minds. The religious really need to get a grip, but they don't because, feelings and all. Facts are uncomfortable and irrelevant when they get in the way of blind faith. So they go the dishonest route, and we've seen where that leads. Absolutely nowhere worthwhile. And I suspect they don't care. They never care. They will never care, because emotions aren't interested in reality. And when that's all you've got, neither do you.